Hello, my friends. I'm so excited to talk to you today a little bit more about our galactic origins. So the last time I spoke with you on this subject, I talked about the larger fragmentations from source energy. If you didn't see that video, be sure to check that out. You may want to watch that one first before you dive into this one. That said, basically what I'm going to be doing today is now we're going to go into the story a little deeper. As I mentioned, we talked about in the last video, the larger fragmentations of source. These were energies that still operated or thought under group consciousness and identified as we. And now we're going to get into some of the first physical incarnations where consciousness is viewed as I. And so we're going to start off with the Lyran civilization. Now, when we're talking about the Lyran civilization, we're talking about billions of years ago. And as a matter of fact, a lot of the stars associated with these storylines were destroyed or are no longer around. But when we're talking about Lyran beings, and you may have heard the term being Lyran starseed, we're talking about some of these original early expressions of source energy. And the Lyran beings were beings that I identify as that first initial creative spark. You know, they very much resonate with me as Aries type energy, explorers, pioneers, creative beings that wanted to bring forth something new, colonize, explore. And this was very much so the energy of what the Lyran beings were. They had passion of going into space and exploring and colonizing and discovering new things and new places. And so if you resonate with being a Lyran starseed, these are some traits that you might easily identify with. And as this story goes on, this original source, these first incarnations of energy, what happened over time was that there began to develop a separate group of individuals from this energy. While the original Lyran starseeds were very much yang expression, that masculine expression, there became a group of Lyrans who decided that really didn't feel like the path for them. Instead of external exploration, they were more concerned or interested in internal reflection. And ultimately, these groups of beings decided to sort of separate, and they ended up traveling closer towards what was the Vega star and the Lyra constellation. Now, these beings spent much time in dedication to spiritual practices, and they actually were very disciplined. These were beings that began to be known as the Vegans, and they were very much about internal reflection. They were connected to nature, and they were tied to a lot of the things that today we might connect with, like a yogic path of interest and different spiritual expressions and modalities. These were all very much the things in which they chose to pursue where their interest was, which was quite different from the Lyrans. And so here we had our first expression of polarity. We had the Lyrans, which were very masculine and externally driven, and then the Vegans, which were very internal, reflective, and more of a feminine expression. And here, both of these identified as very strongly rooted in their polarized expression. Now, with this first expression of polarity, you can only imagine some of the conflicts that might arise. And I just want to point out here that, and I think this is very important in where we are now, to understand that the problem wasn't that one side was right or one side was wrong. The spiritual path wasn't said to be the correct path and the Lyran path was wrong, or vice versa. However, the problem began when each of these species, races, felt like their path was the right path, the way to be. And once we kind of feel these energies root into our system, it then becomes us against them. And here we see the very first beginnings of conflict. There are wars that broke out between the Lyran and the Vegan beings as they had such extreme differences of perspective and were not what I'm feeling. They were not able to empathize or to understand or to respect each other's individual paths of where they were going. And so this was the first introduction that we have in the cosmos as it relates to cosmic wars or strife and conflict. Now, as I mentioned, the Vegans were very disciplined and very committed to their spiritual path. And what happened over time in their desire to connect to Source, they started to think, if I didn't have these emotions, these things that sort of clouded my connection to Source or got in the way they felt of their connection to Source, that maybe they would be more enlightened. They would be more connected, which I find is so interesting because I feel like this is something today that we can see playing out through spiritual bypassing and feeling like we want to be, happy all the time. This need to look a certain way all of the time. And this is very much the path that the Vegans were headed down. They began having an interest in figuring out how they could somehow weed out this emotional portion of themselves. And so with this, they developed a keen interest in technology and genetic manipulation, as they thought that the answer to being what they thought was the closest to Source was to somehow eliminate these emotional, more human-like sides of themselves. And so in doing them, unfortunately, in the midst between that, along with the conflicts and the wars between Lyra, ultimately over an extended period of time, their planet became toxic and they ultimately ended up becoming more mentally oriented and lost that initial mysticism and connection that they had, as they felt like they defined themselves, they molded themselves into what they felt these more disciplined, free of emotional distractions, things along that lines. And in doing so, their planet became very toxic. They started to become sterile. And ultimately ended up, many of them, trying to escape the toxicity of their planet by going underground. And in doing so, over time, their species began to mutate and evolve. They were also threatened with possible extinction. And some of the physical transformations they went through is their eyes became darker and larger, and their skin began to lose its color. You may know where I'm going with this. These beings became what we now know as the Greys, or the Zeta Reticuli. And so their species was threatened with extinction. Now, there are many ways and places and rabbit holes I could go down with this, but just for the sake of keeping it on track, I'm going to avoid a lot of those, and just say, so here in our storyline, we can see stories arising around abduction and people having experiences with the Greys, different experiences of genetic material being taken or, tampered with. And these experiences, like I said, maybe another day I'll go down. But generally speaking, they were as a result of the overall agenda was to save their species. And from this, many hybrid beings came out to be, such as the Asani. So it's at this point in my story that I have to say that it would be so nice if I could, continue to go down this storyline and it be very linear and clear cut. But I invite you to remember that we do live in a very quantum universe where time and space is illusionary. And so there are other species and things that I'm going to talk about that I'm not going to list them in any particular linear fashion, rather just share them as it relates to importance in our personal story of evolution and our galactic origins. So the next thing I want to explore would be the Dracos, or the Reptilians. So when we're talking about the Reptilians or the Dracos, this is what my guides have showed me. This is what really resonates with me. And I believe there are other resources that share something similar. And that is that what resonates with me is that these original Lyran beings, in their interest in expansion and their yang-like qualities, they also, as many other races, were very interested in different genetic materials and their own little science projects. And one of these such projects was exploration of the developing Earth as we know it. Now, as we know, Earth, it's taken us a while to be where we are now. So this would have been very ancient, very fresh and new. And what I have been showed is that the Lyran beings have taken genetic material at early stages in the development of Earth and decided to mix these and reproduce beings that were sort of mixed DNA and genetics from this organic material or an early Earth creation and their own genetic material. And what happened in doing this, it's like, if we kind of look at the consciousness evolving, Earth was very, very new. So in many ways, this was like regressing or going a little bit backwards consciously from where the Lyran beings were at that time in their stage of evolution. And so what happened is what was created out of this mixture of Lyran DNA with these early Earth genetic material was the reptilian beings. And what I find interesting is when we look at that first expression of Lyra coming closest to that origin of source, what originally came out was more of that creative spark, that exciting new energy. However, what came out as a result with the lesser evolved Earth genetics was more of a primal, fear-based survival instinct type being. So these beings, I'm being told were strong, they were mighty, but as far as a conscious level, they were very regressed, considering where the Lyrans were when they had started their journey of evolution. So what happened is the reptilian beings are at the core foundation. They are the primal example of untapped or undealt with fear. It's what happens when we are completely submerged within fear. And what is interesting about this too, I think, to add, is that we have to also remember what we're talking about is consciousness evolving. And we have to remember the power of our thoughts and the power of our beliefs. So in some way, I feel it's important to understand that at some point in our evolutionary journey, there was this placeholder that kind of allowed for this sort of energy to come into play the villain. Because ultimately, many of us, when we hear of stories of reptilians or whatnot, what comes within us is instilled fear. And so I feel like as we start to evolve consciously, we confront our fears, that we're going to realize there's going to be less and less need for our consciousness to need to have these players, these people to fill these roles for us in order for us to go through journeys to evolve our conscious understanding. So, but going back to Galactic Origins, yes. So the reptilians are known to be a part of many challenging stories of wars and death and dark forces in our galactic history. And I think it's also important and interesting to add that you have to picture that, when the Lyran beings originated, it was fresh and new, that creative spark. But really, when we look at the reptilians, by this point, they kind of were brought smack dab in the middle of the polarity chaos, so they sort of just rooted in with survival mode and conquer mode, and decided to just run with that. That said, I would like to also add that not all placements or connections to Dracos are bad. And as a matter of fact, there are many storylines that connect to ancient dragons, and very highly evolved conscious awareness. Also, we have starseeds that have reincarnated here on Earth that have these connections to Dracos, and they are not necessarily meaning that they are negative. These tend to, though, have masculine expressions, be very determined, and are people who are able to make great change and accomplishments in this incarnation. So that would be the Dracos. Moving on, I want to talk a little bit about Orion. And so now one thing I want to add here is when we're talking about Orion, and we're talking about really honestly all of these constellations, we have to remember that, it's kind of like saying all earthlings are like New Yorkers, that we can't say that, because there's a big difference between someone who, is in Massachusetts and someone who's in New York. We all, just even in our own neighborhood, there are so many different expressions. So it is important to understand that when we are talking about these things, that yes, there is, there is an overlaying theme. However, it's not all encompassing, and there are always different energies and expressions that kind of come through in different ways. So when we're talking about Orion, this is how I see Orion. Orion to me was like the melting pot. It was where so many different species, Greys, the Lyrans, the Dracos, a bunch of different species came and kind of like began to mesh around. Also in the Orion Constellation, that's where we have the storyline of the Nantuckets, which were the mermaids, which you may have heard of as well. But Orion was full of all sorts of different energy. And part of the reason why people were so attracted to Orion was because of the nebula. And the nebula served sort of as a cosmic doorway to allow for interdimensional travel. So there you can see, for a variety of different reasons, there being a lot of interest in things such as a doorway to go to, you name it. Now, because this was such a melting pot of different energies, I'm sure you can imagine the strife, the conflict, the wars that were resulting because of these differences and these polarities. And so Orion is very much connected to lots of wars. So much so that another interesting little tidbit is if you watch the Star Wars series, this series is said to be based off of our galactic history connected to the Orion Wars. And so there was a lot of strife that came through in this constellation, and a lot of polarity and issues that sort of had to be worked through. Now, the other thing that I feel is very important when we're discussing Orion is what's called the Orion Net. Okay. Now, this is a little complicated to describe, but I'm going to do my best. So the Orion Net is said to be this energetic net, which a side note here, just to help you grasp the concept of it, I see it as it's very different, but generally speaking, the ideal of a energetic overlay, we can look at our ley lines here on planet Earth. We have this grid, that sort of uncovers the entire planet, okay? And that, those lines, you could say there's so many things you can learn about that, related to significant placements of key sacred places, or, how energy shifts, the Bermuda Triangle. There's so many different things that could be said about our ley lines. Okay, so when we're talking about the Orion grid, unfortunately, at this point in our galactic history, you can say that there were a lot of darker forces. And it is said that the Orion Net was sort of like an energetic boundary and which trapped the souls of those that were incarnated on Orion. So otherwise, a soul might be in Orion. They might go, to, let's say, a star in Lyra. They might go to Sirius or different places. But because of this Orion Net, it's sort of held captive, you could say, the souls and the individuals in that particular constellation, and prevented them from sort of escaping or reincarnating outside of Orion. There's a lot more that goes into this, but basically in the early development of planet Earth, this allowed for certain things and events to take place in which souls were able to escape and reincarnate into Earth. And the reason why this is important in our galactic history is this is one of the first introductions to some of the more extreme karmic journeys related to, you can picture all of the feelings, feeling trapped, feeling controlled, feeling manipulated, the polarity, the wars, us against them, all of these things that these souls experience were brought over into planet Earth. And so the karma in which we are playing out here on our planet is very much interwoven in all of our galactic history. And so that is a lot of information, I feel like, to digest. And there is so much more, but I think that's going to be all for now. I invite you to subscribe if you like this, like the video, keep an eye out, because I'm going to do another one that goes a little deeper yet, covers other galactic races such as Syrian, and I want to talk about the Anunnaki and so much more. So until next time, have a great day. Bye.